All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. So as I said, my name is David Meller. I work here at COS. And today we're going to be talking about pre-registration on the Open Science Framework. What are the benefits to pre-registration? What are the why it's necessary? And then I'll go through sort of step-by-step on how to create a pre-registration if you've never done so before. We do have an ongoing education campaign called the Preregistration Challenge. And if you haven't heard about that, we've got money for $1,000 prizes for those who publish the results of pre-registered work. And so everything I'll be showing you has that in mind about how to create a pre-registration and what it takes to get those published and to get your prize money. So the problem statement that we start out with is the fact that when you have a combination of a very strong bias towards significant and surprising findings in the published literature and flexibility in data analysis, basically allows almost anything to become significant. The result of those two combinations, of those two factors, is largely irreproducible research. So let me give you examples of both of those. There's a strong bias, and it's been known for a long time, that statistically significant findings are much more likely to get published in the literature. And this is probably due to several factors, but it means that either researchers are extremely good at predicting unlikely things, or more likely that only a subset of the available evidence ever gets out into literature. And later I'll dive a little bit more into that. But this figure shows the prevalence or the frequency of p-values amongst about 20 different fields. And it also, you'll see lots of these have tiny bimodal distributions. You see a peak of significant findings right below the magic threshold of 0.05, which is odd in its own right. And what that suggests is that there's ways to manipulate p-values that I'll go into to push them right underneath that magical significance threshold and make them arbitrarily seem more exciting and therefore more publishable. And the flexibility in data analysis allows you to get to that magic threshold of p less than 0.05. And there are lots of demonstrations of this fact that any large data set can be used to find something statistically significant, even if it might just be noise. My favorite analogy is the garden of forking paths. So imagine a fairly straightforward sounding research question. Is there a relationship between X and Y? Are men taller than women, or whatever the research question is? And how do you actually go about operationalizing that straightforward sounding research question is a very dense subject. There's lots of ways to combine variables, both your predictors and your outcomes. There are lots of individual decisions that a researcher or an analyst makes as they're going through that research plan. How do they exclude outliers? Do you control for income, or any demographic variable that you can think of? And quickly, as you go from question to question, start bifurcating the number of possible analyses. And you quickly end up with hundreds, maybe even thousands of very reasonable analyses. And you're rewarded through the publication pipeline to find the subset of those that are statistically significant, even if that is just noise, or even if that the one that you find, the one particular analysis that comes up isn't representative of all the evidence that is available in the data set. This recent publication, this news story came out a little while ago, but it's actually just accepted for publication in a journal. And what researchers did in this situation was take the exact same data set, farm it out to about 20 different pairs of analysts, and ask the exact same question. If you are darker skin-toned football players, more likely to receive penalty cards than lighter-skinned football players. And if you ask that exact same research question using the exact same data to, there's actually 29 different research teams, you'll get different answers depending on the individual decisions that those researchers make when they're making their analysis plan. And not only do they have the exact same data and the exact same research question, but they were allowed to collaborate with each other. So they made their research plan, they got feedback from the other 29 teams, and then these are the final results of the spread of responses. A subset of them are statistically significant, some of them are not. And so, of course, the subset that is most publishable is the subset that is most extreme sounding. So the combination of the bias towards sharing significant findings and the ability to make anything seem significant results in research that is largely irreproducible. So this is one of the main figures from the reproducibility project in psychology. Researchers took 100 published studies, 97% of which, 97 of them were statistically significant. Those were published around 2010, 2011, and directly replicated all of them in higher powered pre-registered, so no flexibility in how the methodology was done for the most part. And the results of those higher powered direct replications were about 37% of them, 37 to 40%, depending on how you answer that question, did it reproduce? But about that many were significant after the high powered replications. And we have ongoing projects in cancer biology. We have many lab projects where several teams of researchers combine to do direct replications, and they all tell about the similar story. That far less than half of the research that's published is reproducible through direct replication attempts, and that is not as high as it should be. If you ask researchers, is there a reproducibility crisis? Depending on the field, a majority of them will say that they've tried and failed to replicate either their own research, that was conducted in their lab, or that of a colleague's. And a strong majority say that yes, there is a major or a slight reproducibility crisis that needs addressing. So one of the major solutions to this is I'll go through the process of creating a pre-registration. And pre-registrations increase credibility by specifying in advance exactly how data will be analyzed. And thus it prevents the biased reasoning from affecting how data analysis occurs. And I'll go into more depth about why that's important. But a pre-registration is a time-stamped read-only plan of your created before you do the study. We do allow existing data sets to be used for these pre-registrations. You can't have analyzed the data. You can't have started conducting summary statistics, because that's going to lead to the biases I'm going to talk more about. But if you're ignorant to what's in the data set, then that's probably okay for creating a pre-registration. But before that point, create the hypotheses, the very specific hypotheses, how you're going to collect the data, what you're going to do to combine your measured variables into to create an index, if you're going to manipulate any variables, if it's an experiment, and then exactly which statistical models you're going to use and what thresholds you use to make an inference in your analysis plan. If you take that research plan and you give it to a journal for peer review and possible acceptance even before results are known, it's known as a registered report. And there are 78, maybe actually today there might be 79 journals that offer this publishing format. I'll go into a little bit more detail about that. But this is a great extension of pre-registration because it improves the research design, and it affects publication bias too. So at stage 1 of peer review, the researchers ask, is the hypothesis well-founded? These are the questions that the peer reviewers and the editors will assess. Are the proposed methods feasible and detailed enough? Is the study very well powered? Usually has to be over 90% powered to find a significant effect. And have the authors included sufficient positive controls to confirm that the study will provide a fair test? So those positive controls are just quality assurance tests. If they're doing an experiment, is there some outcome neutral way to determine that they manipulated the variables correctly, that the experimental manipulation worked? So to prove that they were sort of competently doing the research design. And if all those questions are yes, then the study is conducted, and data collected and analyzed. And afterwards, the final manuscript is submitted to the journal. And at this point, only the following questions matter to whether or not it gets finally published. Did the authors follow the approved protocol? Were the positive controls, did those succeed? Did they prove that they were doing the experiment correctly? And are the conclusions justified by the data? But importantly, none of these things matter, whether the hypothesis was supported, whether they were significant or impactful or novel. Those are all unscientific reasons to make a publication decision, but those are often reasons used today. But these do not come into play with a registered report. So what are all of the problems that preregistration is fixed? One is the file drawer effect. When you put your research plan into a registry, it gives a better baseline data estimation of how much research is going on and how many studies are being conducted. It addresses p-hacking, which I briefly mentioned, but that is that unreported flexibility in how data is analyzed. And it prevents harking, hypothesizing after the results are known. And this is just a little bit of a logical fallacy where you see a trend in a data set, see something that looks exciting or novel, and you use that information to create your hypothesis. You see the trend, you see that there might be a very specific relationship, and then you test that exact same hypothesis with that exact same data set. And so that's circular reasoning. It's bad, don't do it. But it's easy to do unintentionally as you're digging through a data set and exploring through it. Ultimately, the benefit of preregistration is that it makes the distinction between confirmatory hypothesis testing work and exploratory work, which is generating those hypotheses. It makes that distinction much more clear. Let me break apart exactly what those two modes of research look like. When you're confirming, or when you're in the context of confirmation of a hypothesis, this is what we really mean about hypothesis testing research, even in alternative hypothesis testing or null hypothesis. The results of this are held to very high standards of rigor. The goal in this case is to minimize a false positive. You don't want to say that there is an effect. You want to be conservative. You don't want to say there is an effect if there's a decent chance, there's a chance that it might not be. The result of this is a p-value that's interpretable, that makes sense, and it's being used the way it should be used. When you're in discovery mode, you're really looking for something unexpected. You're pushing knowledge into new areas. You're using data-led discovery. You find something unexpected. You do want to minimize false negatives in this case. You don't want to miss an exciting new discovery. You don't want to miss the next penicillin or whatever it is. But when you're digging through a data set looking for those unexpected trends, the p-values that come out of that process are basically meaningless because so many tests are being done, even intuitively or not formally. But when you're in that mode, the p-values don't really make sense because you can't compare all of the p-values that are being considered but rejected and not shared or not reported. It's very hard to keep track of it, how many tests are going on, almost impossible. Unfortunately, when you present exploratory results as confirmatory, using the tools of confirmatory hypothesis testing, that increases the publishability of the results, but that comes at the expense of their credibility. So that is the problem with that. And when you use registered reports, it addresses yet another problem. This gets back to that publication bias. Since the decision to publish has been made before seeing the results, publication bias is addressed. And it has the additional benefit of that first stage of peer review on the research design. And the peer reviewers and the statisticians that are involved in that process can really give great feedback on the study design or the analysis design at that point. So that really greatly improves the work that's being conducted. We all sort of lament or bemoan a research study during peer review that was critically flawed, and if only they had done something different, well, registered reports can address those types of problems too. There are a couple of different ways to go about creating a preregistration. One is you've got a very strong theory-driven a priori expectation going into your study. You've got a very specific research question that you want answered. You create the preregistration with that very specific confirmatory hypothesis test, collect the data, and then and then simply use the preregistration, use the analysis plan from that preregistration to do your typical hypothesis testing. Just use the analysis plan and plug in the numbers and see what comes out significant. After that point, you're free to do whatever you want. You can look for anything unexpected, change the analysis plan, do anything you want, because you've crossed the threshold. You're now in discovery mode. As long as you present the results of that work as discovery or exploratory or hypothesis generating work, don't share the p-values of it, but simply just say we found these unexpected correlations or relationships. And ideally, those unexpected trends should go and feed into a new preregistration for the next round of data collection. This isn't always possible. If we knew exactly what we were doing when we were going into a research endeavor, we wouldn't be researchers. So oftentimes we have very few expectations going into a project. That's okay too. Create your preregistration. It can be a little bit more vague at this point. Say I don't have a very specific analysis plan, but I'm going to stick to my exploratory mode for the beginning. Collect some data, look around for it, and split the data in half. One half of the data you're going to keep secret. You're going to blind yourself to it. Keep it on a different drive. Don't open those files for the time being. But with the open data set, you start looking through it, start looking for trends, start looking for differences or relationships. And when you find something that looks very tantalizing, then take a snapshot right then, pre-register, create another pre-registration, say this is the hypothesis test I'm going to use. The data I'm going to test it on have been collected, but I have not yet looked at them. They've been in a separate location. And then simply confirm those hypotheses with that data that's been held off. This is in machine learning, this is known as sort of model creating versus model testing. There are a couple different ways to explain exactly what that is, but it's all the same workflow of having a validation and a exploration data set. You do lose some power when you do this type of work, but I should mention also that preregistration gives you a very strong and credible reason for using one-tailed hypothesis tests. So that's when you're predicting a very specific direction, not just a general hypothesis. And that does increase your power with that justification. So there are of course trade-offs. In the ratio of the split data, there's controversy. Every paper I see that gives this recommendation has a different one. Some say half, some say a quarter, and 75% for split and confirmation hypothesis testing data. I don't know. I think the jury's still out on that, but half seems appropriate to me. Okay, I'm going to go to the OSF now. Yes. And this is on the Open Science Framework, osf.io/prereg. If you're on your computer, you can follow along. This is what it would look like if you were not logged in. And it would just give you the opportunity to log in or create an account. But once you're logged in at osf.io/prereg, this is what options you have available to you. If it's your first time on the OSF, you'll be given the option only to start a new preregistration. If you have some draft preregistrations, you can continue working on them. If you've got other projects on the OSF that don't have any registrations attached to them, you can start making a preregistration for a project that you already have. For most of you, you'll be right here, start a new prereg. Give a title to the project, test project. And in the back end, let's see, these are just terms about the preregistration challenge. This tells you about how we will review the preregistration if you want us to. If you don't want us to, we will not, but it won't be eligible for one of the prizes. You have to send us the final publication if you want to receive one of the prizes. We give those prizes out once every 6 months. It has to be published in an eligible journal. There are about 5,000 of those journals now, so it shouldn't be too much of a problem. But if you have any questions about that, I'll show you how to get in touch with us. You may be able to use a pre-existing data set as long as you're blinded to it, and there's more details about that in the form. We're only allowed to send money to countries that are not on the US embargo list. So there are a couple of countries on that, but if you have questions about that, I'd be happy to answer them, but most countries are fine. It is generally a large international competition, so most countries are fine. And then here are all the terms and details here. If you have any more questions, you can go through that or send us an email. We'd be happy to explain what those are. So what happened on the back end is that you see the name of the project I created here, test project. So this created a project on the Open Science Framework for you to use, and it put you right into this pre-registration form. So this is the title of the experiment that you're going to do, or the data collection effort. So this is, I'll just say data collection 1 for test project. I only got myself on it right now, but I can find some friends who also have on the Open Science Framework, or so I'll add him, or maybe the search didn't come up with the person, maybe they don't have an account, but I can add a person with their email address, and they'll get an email and show up on the project if they're not on the OSF yet. And we didn't add Alex. Okay. First part of your research plan right here is research questions. These are your pretty generalized research questions. I'm studying this general relationship. And the first very specific section of the research plan is the hypotheses. These do need to be very specific, using the names of the variables that you are going to be collecting and the very specific directions or relationships that you'll be looking for. Effect of X on Y. Here's the first question on the next page about whether or not you're using existing data or you're going to create this pre-registration before you've created the data. So this is the most idealized form of pre-registration, where you haven't yet created the data. It is okay for the pre challenge if you are using data, but nobody in the world has ever seen it. So maybe it's been collected remotely, or maybe it's in a museum and the measurements haven't been taken yet, or something like that. Maybe the data exists and somebody has looked at it, but you haven't looked at it. Nobody on your research team has looked at it yet. So there's no good way for you to have been biased by it. Here's the first gray zone. This is okay for the pre challenge, but it is a little bit more potentially susceptible to biases. Registration prior to analysis of the data. So the data exists, you've been in control of it, but you haven't done any analysis of it yet. And we define analysis as once you start doing summary statistics of the data set. That's when you can really start to be biased by the data set and be susceptible to harking, hypothesizing after results are known. So this, again, is okay, but you will have to give an explanation. This last section would not be eligible for one of the prizes for the pre-registration challenge. You could still use the form if you want, but just won't be eligible. If you have started conducting summary statistics of the data, then it's too likely that you've been, or there's too much opportunity for bias at that point. So that would not be eligible, but you could still use the form, but just not be eligible for a prize. I'll say registration prior to analysis of the data, and I'll give an explanation down here of what steps I've taken to ensure that I haven't been biased by the data set. What I'm going to do to collect more data, or if necessary, or what I did to collect the data. What my sample size is, how many participants or how many data points are being collected. The rationale for that data collection. Hopefully it's a power analysis. It doesn't have to be. I'd say about maybe 2/3 of the pre-registrations we get don't have a formal power analysis. They simply say the sample size was determined based on limited time, limited money, and you know, that's okay for the purposes of the pre-registration challenge of creating your own pre-registration. If you're trying to get this published through a registered report, they probably will require a power analysis. But most pre-registrations that researchers are creating aren't part of those registered reports. And so data collection is, of course, determined by how much data you can spend, you can collect. This stopping rule right here, one of the unreported areas of flexibility that comes up from time to time is you collect some data, see if it's significant, collect a little bit more data, see if it's significant, and do that multiple rounds of testing. And that really inflates the false positive rate. That really sort of invalidates the test statistics. And so that's a no-no. You can create a very specific set of preset optional stopping rules where you specify exactly when you're going to stop data collection and exactly what your thresholds are going to be for each test moving forward until you get through your entire data collection effort. If you have questions about that, I can send you some references. But it's but most folks will simply say they'll collect data until the semester runs out, or they'll collect data until they run out of money, or sometimes they'll say, I'm just going to keep on collecting data until I get 1,000 samples or whatever it takes. So those are the types of rules that are appropriate. Variables, we have 3 sections of variables for manipulated variables, measured variables, and indices. So if you're doing an experiment, you're obviously going to be manipulating some factor, so just describe what you're going to be manipulating. If you're doing an observational study, just write not applicable. Here, give a list of all the variables you're going to measure in the study. And of course, again, if it's an observational study, all the relevant variables are going to be measured variables. If you're doing an experiment, maybe only the outcome variables are going to be measured, but you might also collect other demographic data, for example. So describe all of that here. Any relevant predictors, outcomes, or whatever that you're going to be measuring and not experimentally manipulating. Here in the indices section, most of the time, the formal statistical tests will not just be conducted on 1 or 2 variables that were directly measured, but are often combined. My background is ecology. There are dozens of different indices of biodiversity. Just specify which one you're going to use. If you're measuring happiness, it might be a combination of 5 different responses that the participants gave. Just describe how that process is going to happen. Factor analysis is something that a lot of researchers do, where you collect 10 or 100 or whatever number of variables and look for a new combination of variables that explains the variance in the data set. And that is really creating a new variable that you're going to use for later analysis. So you can describe that process here, or you could describe it in the analysis plan because it is quite analytical. You'll notice I skipped over this for some of them, but a lot of the questions have the ability to attach a file. So if you've got a sort of a complex answer, if you've maybe got a whole bunch of variables and you don't want to use the little boxes on the form right here, you can upload pretty much any file. Oftentimes they're Word docs or sometimes PDFs, sometimes images, but simply upload whatever file you want. And then you'll see it appear up here, file selected for upload. And if you make an error, you can just remove it from the form right there. Here's your basic study design. We put this a little bit later because in sampling plan and variables, that's where some folks were getting in trouble. So we wanted to put those a little bit higher up. But this is the basic study design. It's an experiment, observational study. We've had a few meta-analyses come in. Is there any blinding involved in the study or not? Here's where you say, I'm doing a complete factorial design with these different levels. So you can just say what kind of study design you have at that point, whether or not you're doing any randomization. And then the most detailed part of the preregistration is here in the analysis plan, where you give very specific statistical tests for each hypothesis that you've listed earlier. One thing that we do look for is continuity between hypotheses, variables, and your analysis plan. So if you have 5 or 10 hypotheses, make sure that it's very clear in the statistical models how each one of those hypotheses are going to be addressed. Sometimes, a complex model, you can address a lot of hypotheses. With a Mancova, you could address a whole lot of hypotheses. Just specify that hypotheses, 1 through 4 will be addressed through this particular model. If your hypotheses are fairly straightforward, a series of t-tests, for example, just make sure you number, t-test 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, just so it's very clear for reviewers and for any other later readers, which could include yourself when you're analyzing the data, exactly how many tests you're running and exactly what variables are included in each one of those tests. So be very precise in the stats model section. If you're doing any statistical transformations, noted here. A follow-up analysis is generally when you run an omnibus test, for example, at ANOVA, or multiple regression or whatever. And if that comes back significant and you start looking for either interactions or pairwise comparisons within the omnibus test, specify what those are here in the follow-up analysis. Sometimes it's not applicable, but it often is. Inference criteria. Most folks, of course, are still using null hypothesis significance testing, which is fine. Preregistration is, really makes that process much more credible and rigorous. So if you're using p-values, which most people are, and I encourage it, just say what those p-values are. Obviously, most will be using 0.05. You can say if you're going to do any sort of Bonferroni correction or anything else like that. And please note if you're doing one-tailed tests or two-tailed tests or whatever. Data exclusion, make these rules up front. It's not fair to cherry pick which participants didn't cooperate after you see what they did. So decide up front how you're going to determine whether or not to include or exclude any given research subject or research participant. What you're going to do with any missing data. Sometimes it'll be sort of averaged in some ways. Sometimes it'll some models can exclude it in other ways. So just give the rule for how you'll be doing that. And this is, I kind of call it the oxymoron part of the pre-registration, where you can pre-specify exploratory studies. And we just put this in there because people were putting it in anyway, and we couldn't find an appropriate other place to put it. If you've got, if you know you're going to collect, for example, demographic data, but you don't have a strong theory-driven reason why men should respond differently than women, or income should affect the results, or age, or anything else like that. But you're going to collect that data anyway, and you want to have some room to say what you're going to do with that. You can put it here, and it just helps remember that that was exploratory research. And if anything interesting comes out from that, that does require later confirmation. So this is optional, but you can put it down if you'd like to. If you have an analysis script, you can and should upload that. You don't have to. Most folks don't, but it's a nice optional step. If you have any other information, you can put it here on the last page. Sometimes folks will put in their lit cited, or sort of an explanation that this has been accepted as a registered report or something else like that. Again, this is obviously optional. Here's a preview of what the pre-registration looks like. All of your answers are on this page. And here at the bottom, you can go back, continue editing. You can register without review. If you do that, it's not going to be eligible for a prize, but you're encouraged to use the form if you don't want it to be reviewed. If you do submit for review, we get back to you within 2 business days. And we just do a quick check. This is not peer review. We are looking for whether or not the analysis plan is complete, whether or not all the answers sort of make sense and there's continuity between your hypotheses, variables, and how you're going to analyze the data. But we obviously are not reviewing whether or not the research questions are meaningful or appropriate or anything else like that. Just making sure that the form was completed fully. So I'll submit for review right here. This is where you do have to agree to those terms that we've already talked about. If you register without review, you don't have to agree to that. So just make note. I'm going to keep on going here. And here you have the option to make it public immediately or to enter it into an embargo. And I think a small majority of folks, about 60%, use some sort of embargo period. This can be up to 4 years. Oftentimes it'll be less than that, but just gives you time to keep everything private while you're still collecting the data. Oftentimes folks are a little bit nervous about getting scooped, or sometimes participants finding out about the study that you're conducting, and that can bias the results on. So you can use this embargo period for up to 4 years. All right, and then there you go. That's been submitted. It's here under draft right now, pending review. So you'll get an email when the answers come back. But until then, you can look at your plan, but you can't edit it until the reviews come back. Let me go back to a couple more Q&As here. All right, for writing up your pre-registered work, 3 important rules when you're doing that. Make sure to include a link to your pre-registrations in your manuscript. So everything on the OSF has these short persistent URLs, 5 GUID, or 5 characters right here, osf.io/ a couple of numbers and letters. So use that to put a link to your pre-registration somewhere in your article. It can be in line, it could be in a footnote, or someplace else like that. But when you're describing your analysis, make sure to specify that the work was pre-registered. The second major rule is to make sure you report the results of all your analyses. So if you said you were going to do 20 t-tests, make sure you report the results of all 20 t-tests, and don't report them in a supplemental material. Those have to be reported in the main body of the text. If those were confirmatory hypothesis tests, they need to be all reported, whether or not they were significant. And then 3, anything that was unregistered, you're encouraged to do that. This doesn't tie your hands to do any sort of discovery, but you do just simply have to report that these were unregistered analyses. So if you have other experiments that were run as part of your article or part of your series of studies, just don't label them as registered. If you collected a bunch of data, analyzed it with confirmatory hypothesis testing, and then did some additional exploration in that data set, that's fine too. Just label it as unregistered. I've got a couple of FAQs on here. Let me just check to see if folks have been sending in any questions, and then I'll get back to this. Let's see here. I'll stop sharing. I don't think anybody's listed any questions or in the chat or in the Q&A. So I'm going to go through a couple of FAQs, and then I'll stop. Let me share my screen again. Okay. So the first question, does pre-registration work? Well, this recent study came out a couple of years, 2 years ago, and what the researchers did was use a resource called the Time Sharing and Experiments in the Social Sciences. And this is kind of like a registry, but what researchers do is they submit questionnaires to this group, who then farms out the questionnaires to a representative sample of US adults, I think. So they get questions in, they do the survey, and they get responses back. And so this TESS database has a large number of responses to a large number of surveys. And the researchers, what they were able to do is compare what was collected to what was finally published. And of course, so here's one of the main figures. So here's the number of outcome variables that were specified in the questionnaire. On the horizontal axis. On the vertical axis is how many outcome variables were reported in the article. The diagonal line represents those articles that reported every question in the questionnaire, every outcome variable from the questionnaire. And of course, you can't report something that wasn't collected, so there are no dots above the line, and there are several dots below the line. That by itself isn't a problem. That just shows that some of the outcome variables were not reported. maybe it was done in an unbiased way. So fortunately, researchers were able to compare what was reported to what was not reported. The reported tests were largely significant, had a moderately large effect size. The median p-value was 0.02 of the outcome variables that were reported in articles. Those that were unreported was a different story. Median p-value is 0.35. The effect size was half, and only 23% of them were statistically significant. And what this shows is the fact that these questionnaires, these studies were obviously done in the exact same way, the exact same sample size. There was no a priori reason for determining what was be reported or not. Everything was deemed appropriate from at the get-go, that these questions were worth asking, but only a biased subset of our knowledge is getting shared in the published literature, as this study demonstrates. And so these weren't formal pre-registrations, but they serve the purpose of what a pre-registration serves. And so so this shows how much bias there is. A lot of folks are worried about being scooped. When you create a pre-registration, as I already mentioned, you've got the ability to embargo your pre-registration for up to 4 years. But I think a more even better response to that fear is the fact that when you make your pre-registration, you've got a time-stamped record of your research ideas that you can cite. And so that is really how you stake provenance and stake your claim to an idea in a very credible way with these pre-registrations. By the time you've created the pre-registration, you're basically ready to go. So if somebody were to see the idea and to try to beat you to the finish line of publication, you're already far ahead of the game at this point, ready to collect data. So for these 3 reasons, I don't think that fear should be too big of a fear. Folks often ask, isn't it easy to cheat on these? Couldn't you make a quote unquote pre-registration, but after you've already collected the data? Or could you make 5 pre-registrations and only cite 1 that worked? Well, so both of those are easy to do. Yes, you could cheat in this process, but it does make it harder to do, and much more intentionally, and it makes the process much more intentional. Most pre-registrations are really designed to help keep us honest to ourselves, just as a strong, very clear reminder of what our pre-specified hypotheses were. So it just helps you keep you honest to yourself. And if you're going to, take those steps to cheat the system anyway, then there's no system you build is going to really prevent that. But it does make it more intentional and sort of as a reminder to yourself what you said you were going to do. All right, with that, I will stop talking. I'll start taking questions. I'm going to make sure to email these slides to everybody who RSVP'd for the webinar. But if you want to right now, you can start taking down some of these links, and I'll show you where some of these links are again in just a minute. But this is where the presentation lives on the OSF. If you want to start your registration now, go ahead. I encourage it. osf.io/prereg. And on our website, we've got all of these resources of articles and FAQs and so forth. Feel free to email me if you have questions, and our email address is all over these materials also, so please do reach out. With that, I'm going to stop my screen share and check again for questions. Near the bottom of the screen, you should have the ability to either put a question into the chat or to use the Q&A feature. So please do that if you've got any questions now. Otherwise, you can log out. If you've got questions about registered reports, they're here on our website, cos.io/rr. Shows the a little bit about the workflow, what journals are participating in it, details about what a registered report is. If you're ready to get started now, cos.io/prereg gives you information about what this whole thing is about. There are a lot of resources and a lot of detailed FAQs on our resources page right here. A lot of FAQs, a lot of other resources. One thing that we put together just recently, this list of example pre-registrations. So here's about 10 or so that we found that are very clear, very straightforward. They come from different disciplines. Some of them are experiments, some of them are observational studies. Some of them were registered before creating the data. So take a look at the resources if you have any questions. All right. I'll stay on the line for one more minute, but otherwise, no more questions are coming in, so have a good day. Class dismissed.